So Matt, first of all, can you introduce yourself for those who didn't know you that well?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Matt Jordan. I'm a Canadian strength and conditioning coach and applied sports scientist. My background is working with a majority is winter sport athletes, but I also have athletes from mixed martial arts and American football, all kinds of sports. My PhD is in medical science with a big focus on how ACL injury affects muscle strength and power. And I've got a big interest in testing and monitoring athletes after ACL injury to describe, define, predict things that help them get back to that pre-injury performance level.
Nice, nice, nice. So today's question we're gonna discuss a lot about like the ACL injury. And also I noticed these because you have done a lot of like great online seminar.
Thanks.
And I do enjoy your online course.
Oh, right on. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So the first question is like, why does like the ACL injury happens in terms of like the muscle contraction time?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that there's still a lot left to be explained about how these injuries happen, and the ones that we're mostly interested in are what we call the non-contact ACL injuries. So this is one where an athlete is typically changing direction or landing from a jump, and there's nothing around them, and in this maneuver that they're doing, they impart enough load through the knee joint that the ACL ruptures. And we call these non-contact ACL injuries because there's no external object or force that's like being applied to the limb that's causing the rupture. It's something that's happening due to the mechanics and the neuromuscular control strategy of the athlete in this movement. And the main thing around this is that it affects 4 to 6 times more female athletes than males. There's a huge risk of re-injury. So if you compare athletes with an ACL injury to those who don't have an ACL injury, athletes with an ACL injury are at 40 times greater risk of a second ACL injury relative to a non-injured counterpart. And at the end of the day, it's a devastating occurrence. So what we are trying to do is to understand the biomechanics and the neuromuscular control strategy that contribute to this. And one thing that we think is important is that because these injuries are happening in such a short time frame, that what's happening before the injury in terms of how muscles are working and how body positions are lined up, and then what's happening during the injury, specifically around how quickly muscles can make force, are potential contributors to what we say is like dynamic knee joint stabilization. So it's like the way I think about it in simple terms is that if you have if you're talking about an injury event and you look at the ACL is a mechanoreceptor, and it obviously does provide mechanical stability, but the muscles are so essential for creating dynamic knee joint stability. And obviously the muscles and the positions and the postures are the things that we can train and address that potentially offload the knee. We think of them as being kind of crucial in preventing these non-contact injuries.
Nice. So for like training these for like performance training or like strength training, is there a way to like prevent the injury happens?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is maybe not preventing, but can you take an athlete who's at high risk and can you bring down the risk of an injury potentially by influencing their strength or how they do movements? And I think that our best evidence right now is that, yeah, if you had a high risk athlete and they were demonstrating either neuromuscular control strategies or biomechanical characteristics in the change of direction movement or a landing, and you were able to use the strength training and movement training to be able to improve those things, that yes, it would have an effect on reducing ACL rupture. And I think where from an evidence standpoint, where you see this being relatively profound is really simple, straightforward neuromuscular warm-ups in athletes who are naive to training. They don't have big training histories, they haven't had a strength coach, but you take them and you expose them to some basic basic movements that are geared towards providing better strength and better mechanics for related to ACL rupture, it does seem to have an effect in reducing the ACL injury rate. So I think at the end of the day, it's the answer is probably yes, but there's still a lot going on. I mean, the injury rates with female athletes has sort of remained unchanged. When you take a look at athletes who've been exposed to these neuromuscular warm-ups, and then so now I'm thinking in the context of for your listeners, anybody who's a strength and conditioning coach worth their salt is training athletes with specific intention around good biomechanics, good strength and power capacity. And in those populations, ACL injuries still happen. So, I guess what it comes back to is, what's going on in those environments that can reduce injury risk. And I think in that case, it does get a little more complicated because they still happen. And I wouldn't say that we've been able to completely eradicate the issue, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to discuss about like after an athlete suffer an ACL injury, and when we like get the chance to get involved with this kind of process, helping athlete return to play for like for in the weight room or like strength and conditioning, how exactly can we help our athlete return to play?
Well, I think the main thing is that there it's a long-term process. I think a lot of times when strength and conditioning coaches get involved in ACL injuries, they sort of are handed off an athlete maybe at 9 months. At least this is my experience in how it used to be in our environment and how I feel it is in lots of other environments that I've seen. You get handed off an athlete at 9 months who's been quote unquote cleared to return to sport. And then typically what we'll do is resume training and try to get them strong and try to, get them fit and get them back playing their sport. But I've always found it quite interesting and almost alarming that typically when you look at when athletes hurt their knee again, so if they suffer a re-injury, it's typically about 2 years down the road. And it's very often to the contralateral limb. And so as a strength and conditioning coach and somebody who's worked in, elite sport my entire life, I sort of see that what gets cleared at 9 months, and then, you look down the road to 2 years where that athlete now suffers a re-injury. I think there's a lot of gaps in there that need to be addressed. And obviously that's where our expertise becomes front and center. So when I would be working with athletes back in the day, I realized that after 9 months, that one of the things I can do is continue to address the deficits that are associated with ACL rupture. And I can continue to do that over not just, a couple more months, but actually potentially a couple more years. And that doesn't mean that the athlete is on a rehab program, but I say it's like they're on a return to performance training program, which is, yes, you're back to sport and maybe you're working your way back to competition, but we know that you're going to be missing a step for at least a couple of years after that injury, and you're going to have this increased risk of injury down the road. So this idea of return to performance training, I think that's where strength and conditioning coaches play a vital role. We can play a vital role by monitoring the athlete with either biomechanical testing or muscle strength and power testing through that time period to identify whether they continue to progress back towards what their desired state is, or if they actually start to regress. The second thing that we can do is we can get a really good understanding of what that pre-injury benchmark needs to look like. This has been something that over the years has become increasingly more obvious to me. It was always there, but more and more it seems obvious, but we maybe overlook it, is that our standard is usually to compare the athlete's injured side to their non-injured side. And then we say, hey, you're good, you're symmetrical, or your strength levels are the same. But we have lots of data and lots of case studies where with injury, the non-injured limb actually starts to detrain with time. And so, that detraining effect means that you're symmetrical, but you've actually decreased strength capacity in both limbs. So now, it's like oh, cool, you picked the boxes. We've got what we think are, appropriate benchmarks about this post-injury benchmark, but it's not an ideal benchmark. So another thing I think that strength and conditioning coaches can really do is to understand the sport, understand the demands of that sport, and to create objective benchmarks of function and strength and power that are needed to support the sport. And then after injuries are sustained, we can use those benchmarks to compare both legs over time. And we can use that as criteria to sort of get that athlete working over many, many, many months back to that pre-injury performance level. And I think that's a crucial gap that, strength and conditioning coaches are well poised to fill. And I'll say the last and final thing is that I can remember being the first time I watched a surgeon do an ACL reconstruction surgery, and this case, a surgeon was doing what we call a hamstring autograft or a semitendinosus autograft. I was shocked to watch the surgeon go in there and to remove and hook onto the entire semitendinosus tendon and to strip it out to reconstruct the torn ACL. And I always thought in the back of my head that maybe it was a piece of the tendon or a part of it. Like I never really conceptualized that they're trying to create a new, basically a tendon ligament that has to have the footprint of the ACL. And so it needs to be relatively big. And I was completely shocked when they removed that. And I was also completely shocked when I watched them do what they call the other procedures of bone patellar tendon bone graft, where they literally cut out a hunk of the tibia a hunk of bone on either side of your patellar tendon and the middle third of the tendon, and they use that. And I was like, oh my Lord. So what the downstream effects of this are for strength and conditioning coaches is that it's not just the ACL rupture, but because of how they fix the ACL, there's all sorts of comorbidities that affect muscle groups where now they've used either part of your own tissue or the injury itself has caused inhibition or reflexive inhibition, or, you've got other factors like, the fact that muscles become stubborn to hypertrophy training. All of these things point to the fact that, and I give a quote to Eric Mera here, who's an excellent physiotherapist. If you haven't ever had him on your show, it would be great. He says that after the ACL injury has been repaired and fixed, it then becomes a muscle injury. And, I think that's where, strength and conditioning coaches are particularly well suited for addressing the fact that this is a neuromuscular injury and that our muscle function, whether it's from the graft or from the ACL rupture that, causes changes to our quadriceps, but together those things require resistance training, strength and power training, and a really good planned approach. And certainly, another area where strength and conditioning coaches can provide a ton of expertise.
Cool. So from strength training, I know there's going to be a lot of like coaches discuss about like max strength. How exactly like max strength going to improve our or like improve our ability to like prevent us getting injury or like reduce the injury chances. So what are your thoughts on like the max strength?
Well, I mean, I think the general consensus is, if we look at the literature, that strength training seems to exert a positive effect on our injury resilience. So, I think the research supports it right out at the outset, for this being effective, and the mechanisms maybe then become the things that we need to figure out. So, part of it could be, that, our muscles and our tendons become stronger because of the fact that we put load through them, so they hypertrophy. Another thought as well is that there's a decent body of evidence now showing that even ligaments like ACLs, the ACL actually has a higher protein synthetic rate than muscle. And they've examined this in studies where they've looked at how structures in the knee joint actually are turning over. And the fact that the ACL has this extremely high protein turnover rate suggests that it is adaptable to load. And in fact, when you look at athletes from sports where they have a preferred landing side, like let's say figure skating, they tend to have a more hypertrophied ACL on that landing side. So, that's another idea, is that if we can hypertrophy tissues, like make them bigger and make them more resilient against load, we basically increase their load capacity, right? So I think one way that maximal strength training in general affects our bodies is our tissues change. which to me is a good thing, because if I have a bigger cross-sectional area, I have a higher capacity to dissipate energy and a better stress capacity for that tissue. So that's maybe more of a mechanistic thought. But then another way that I sometimes look at it is that if you have, like, if you take the hamstrings and let's say you're in an injury event and you require a certain amount of strength to dissipate energy, and you look at two legs and one leg is double the strength of the other leg, and we're talking about a time frame where you have a limited amount of time to apply force. All things being equal, the stronger athlete probably also has a higher rate of force development capacity. And so at any given instance in time, there's a greater amount of torque coming from that muscle group to be able to dissipate energy. And so that's another thought that I think is more of let's just call it a way that our muscles can absorb energy that might be there to cause an injury. I think that strength exerts a protective effect. And sometimes I'll use this example in class to keep it super simple. And I know mechanistically, like from a biomechanics perspective, this is a gross oversimplification. But if you have, some sort of energy that's coming into the body that's the equivalent of, let's say, a couple hundred joules, and you have a maximum strength capacity, relatively speaking, that is almost, let's say, 10 or 15% higher than that. And you're talking about the end of the match where you've been, doing repeat sprints and muscle groups are getting fatigued. You can imagine a scenario where now your strength capacity drops below the amount that you need to dissipate that energy. And then you think about a scenario now where, you double that person's strength. Now that just means that, it's kind of defined by what we call the RM continuum. If I am at 50% of my 1 RM strength, and, by definition, that is a percentage that is much more oriented towards strength endurance capacity than it is my maximum strength capacity, which just means that I've got what the word I use is the strength reserve, right? You've got that buffer between what your maximum capacity is and what you need. And I think that's an interesting way to look at, training is we're not just training athletes to have enough strength to do the sport skill or the sport and, whatever movements they need to be able to do, but we're actually trying to train athletes for their worst day, which might mean that we are trying to create a buffer between what your ceiling capacity is and what you need, so that in the event that you get pushed over that limit, you've got the reserve to be able to handle those potential injury scenarios. So there's a couple of ways I think strength confers positive benefits with respect to injury.
Great. So the next thing is like it comes from like the online seminar you did, and on the online seminar you mentioned that when the injuries occurs, it's probably like the muscle contraction was too quick. If we only train our like maximal strength, it's probably over like 200 milliseconds or 300 milliseconds. It's way longer than the hamstring injury or like the ACL injury occurs. So what should we do to like to merge the gap?
Well, I think this is now moving into the realm of, so I think initially, if you're untrained, everything's entangled, right? So your max strength capacity, your rapid force capacity, your eccentric strength capacity, and an untrained person, all these things are wrapped in together. So that means if I take a young athlete who's, previously untrained and low capacity in general, and I have them do general strength training, everything comes up. Their strength comes up, their power comes up, their eccentric strength comes up because they just start to move along together. But eventually, this idea, coined by Dietmar Schnipleicher, but it's a specific adaptation to the imposed demand, right? The SAID principle, which is this idea that, with time, these capacities start to disentangle, meaning that, as I specialize in getting, let's just say, really strong, or I specialize in increasing my hypertrophy, or I specialize in increasing my rate of force development capacity or my eccentric strength capacity, at certain times, these things start to become highly specific to how we train. So in these situations, it's like, let's take two extreme examples. Does does a power lifter who's extremely strong have a lower risk of ACL rupture playing soccer than a less strong but highly effective soccer player? Now, I don't know the answer to this, but I guess anybody who would analyze sport would probably say, well, for the power lifter and for playing soccer, it's more than just strength, right? Now we're talking about the ability to create stiffness, put myself in positions and postures that safeguard the ACL, biomechanics of how we change direction. All of these things start to become paramount. And, one of the things that I say is that, your strength reserve and building your strength capacity is foundational. But then in the context of really understanding the sport and how the athlete uses their body to create effective movement, technique, tactics, this is where we start to think about things like the rate of force development capacity, biomechanics, positions and postures, how we create stiffness, how we share load between the joints. Now it's sort of becoming, I guess, a more nuanced understanding of training. So, again, I think there's some evidence here to suggest it's not just all about strength. There's actually some really nice studies from Denmark where they've used surface EMG and examined change of direction capacity in elite handball players, female handball players. And they've been able to show that, the co-contraction between quadriceps and hamstrings, for example, are actually associated with injury risk. And that isn't a strength thing per se. That's a neuromuscular control strategy. And we know that if you're, creating co-contraction, you're removing slack from tendons and connective tissue and muscle, that obviously is going to increase your rate of force development capacity and your joint stiffness. So these are things now where it's like, okay, just because you have the strength doesn't mean you use it. If you don't have it, you can't use it. But, that quote's from my good friend Sophia Nymphius. But just because you have it doesn't mean you use it, right? So this is this notion that, once you have strength capacity, and this is sometimes the secret sauce of great strength and conditioning coaches, is they're just really good at allowing athletes to become more effective in accessing this strength capacity rather than just continually trying to bolster up and increase strength over time. And certainly that's an area of interest for us in our research, is looking at neuromuscular control strategies and RFD capacity and eccentric strength capacity and how they relate to knee joint loading and injuries.
Nice. I'm glad that you brought up the core contraction. So since it's not really a strength kind of stuff, it's more of a neuromuscular control. How exactly can we improve our ability to the core contraction?
Well, I think I'll go with three components. Number one is there's a really nice study that I often quote where they were examining hamstring co-contraction in isokinetic leg extension. It's an old study. But essentially, the way the study goes is that they were able to measure co-contraction in, let's say, less strong and more strong athletes. And there was a component there of obviously strength training. And one thing that they observed was that the effect of strength training seemed to increase the level of coactivity. So just by making the muscle groups stronger, there seemed to be an influence on how athletes use that increased strength in a neuromuscular control strategy in a positive way. I've also read some really interesting studies was one in particular in skiers where they essentially used a range of external task constraints. So they cued the athlete and they had them focus on, in some cases, internal physiological cues versus external cues. And what they were able to show was that when they measured hamstring co-contraction in skiers that were doing these jump landings, they could actually modulate hamstring activity. So meaning that in the little period of time before they landed, it seemed like athletes were actually adopting a neuromuscular control strategy that would be essentially more protective against shear forces and tibial rotational loads, which we know put stress and strain on the ACL. So, again, and we see that as well, is that in the case of, how you cue an athlete, there's an immediate effect on how they control musculature and how they basically create that coactivity. And then the last thing I'll say as well is that in addition to having them focus on this, so in the second example, it might be something like you're in the air and it's like before you land, they give you an active cue to increase the tension in your hamstrings, basically is an example of what the sort of cue they used in that the second example and in that study. And then the third one would be, in my mind, is the idea of really training positions and postures. So, this would be always an extension of what I would try to do with my training programs is around strength training and building capacity would always be sort of integrating movement competencies and position and postural work to help athletes understand where they need to be and how they need to be in order to basically protect their knee. And so I often refer back to an example of an UFC fighter I used to train. He was a mixed martial artist, and he, was in a fight, and was against a guy who was more experienced in sort of Taekwondo, and he got caught with a kick, and it essentially, basically, for lack of a better word, it didn't fully knock him out, but he doesn't remember anything. So from that moment on, his body goes into complete muscle memory, motor memory, and in that time frame between him going down, he was able to somehow grab onto the opponent's leg, take him to the ground, grabbed his back, and was able to finish the fight with a submission and a choke. And you'll see this as well if anybody who watches combative sports, in UFC, for example, if somebody does get knocked out, when they start to come together again, they almost instinctually go for a leg of the ref, or they go to try to get on the ref's back. Like, it's I would almost say a pre-programmed motor response. It's in a different level of the brain. It's not conscious, like, oh, I have to do X now because of Y. It's just like this drilling of movement. And I think in this case, it's a really interesting idea. I don't know where all the research sort of stands on this, because I'm not a motor learning person, but I really do think in this idea of increasing co-contraction that if you can ingrain positions, postures, and ways to move that safeguard the knee joint, and you can create dual task demand where you're having athletes have to react to a ball, react to visual stimulus, but you're constantly forcing them into positions and postures that are more protective of the knee joint. I really think there's a way to confer a benefit related to reducing the risk of an ACL injury. It was a strategy that I always used to use with our women's alpine ski team. Would be, 2, 3, 4 times a week. Obviously we're doing heavy amounts of strength training and all the normal stuff, but we would also have this I called them the essentials, which was literally position and postural training to safeguard the knee joint. So get them landing and absorbing energy in positions where I know the ACL is not super strained, getting them stacked, getting them doing that on demand in response to perturbations or to reaction in their environment. And, really at the end of the day, it was to try to automate this motor response so that when they do find themselves in a position where they're now focused on other stuff, they just have the motor memory to get back into the right position and posture. And I think that's an interesting way to approach that problem.
Nice. So I know you did a great paper, great research with Chris Bishop about the force plate testing, about performance side of stuff, and neuromuscular fatigue, how to monitor the neuromuscular fatigue and return to play standpoint, right? So can you give us some thoughts about how exactly does that suits into the force plate testing suits into the ACL injury?
Well, I mean, I think simply put is when what I've been chasing my entire career as a strength and conditioning coach were testing methods that were feasible. Like I could do them. They weren't going to require me going to a lab and spending 45 minutes or an hour collecting data. So I could do it in 5 minutes. They were accurate, and I could determine the accuracy. And importantly, I could ensure that the tests were reliable, meaning that from one test to the next test, the flux and the noise in the data and whatnot would be smaller than the detectable change that I want to see. And I guess the final piece about it is that I have some biological rationale for why this stuff would work. And that's one of the papers that Chris led up was, kind of 3 keys to choosing metrics right around a force plate and a counter movement jump or a drop jump. Feasible, you got a biological basis, and it's repeatable and sensitive to the things that you care about. And so in the context of ACL rupture, what I'm interested in doing with an athlete is ensuring, if let's say it's a lower body sport, is ensuring that they are effective at applying energy into the ground, because that's what makes them move. Physics, right? The more energy I can put into the ground in the right direction, the faster I'm going to go, the higher I'm going to jump, the more I'm going to be able to do things effectively in my sport world. And so a force plate is really a measure of the external ground reaction force acting on the body center of mass, which is now a coupling of the muscular forces that I generate, but it's also a coupling of my movement. So if I'm standing on a force plate and I just move my arms like this, my ground reaction force changes, right? If I turn my head, my ground reaction force changes. If I squat and jump, my ground reaction force changes. And so together, what we say is that a vertical jump on a force plate is a way to look at not only the muscular capacities, obviously the energy that's being generated by the muscles, but we can also look at it with regard to the movement strategy, because you can see that in the vertical ground reaction force tracing. And so where it becomes really valuable is that now you have a system where you can literally take an athlete doing a jump, any variation of a jump, squat, isometric mid-thigh pull, whatever, and you can get a measure of how effective they are at putting force into the ground. And so after ACL rupture, because of the fact that our movement strategies change, our muscles become untrained, things happen because of the injury. Now you've got this really straightforward, pragmatic monitoring tool where you can measure in a closed chain movement the effectiveness of that athlete at doing the things we care about. And it just so happens that in jumping and in squatting and in mid-thigh pulling or a leg press or a squat, that the force time characteristics do seem to be sensitive to how athletes recover after injury, particularly ACL rupture. So with time, with training, as a function of the types of injuries they have, these measures appear to improve or change with time in ways that help us quantify whether or not an athlete is sufficiently rehabilitated. So, I'll just end by saying is that what we used to do is we'd bring the athlete in, you'd be doing squats or jumping, and I would watch you move. And I would say, it looks good. You look like you're symmetrical. You look like you're strong. But meanwhile, if I stuck you on a couple force plates, it would be like, oh my gosh, you're 30% different side to side. It looks good, but it's not good, if you know what I mean. So with force plates, what it really lets you do is put a number to that functional capacity. And I think it's a really valuable tool because jumping in the context of a sport environment, a couple force plates, lots of commercial opportunities now to buy these things for relatively affordable prices. Jumping is a really easy thing to teach an athlete. It's standardized, it's repeatable, and you can run a jump test on a weekly basis, no problem. You can run a jump test, every 3 to 4 weeks with an athlete recovering from injury. So I think taken together, it's just a really pragmatic tool, and I think it can help us be much more objective about quantifying recovery after injury.
Love that. So the next thing I want to discuss is about like the energy system. I know you put up a table and divided like the energy system into like 7 zones. So can you walk us through how exactly did you put up or divide it into like 7 zones?
Yeah, no problem. I mean, there's not really where do I start the answer to this question? before I became a strength and conditioning coach, and a lot of people don't, maybe, people who know me personally don't really know my background in this as much, but I actually started as an endurance athlete. So I was a triathlete in high school, and I was a speed skater, and you know, I did endurance sport. I was an Olympic distance triathlete as my main sport, and I was very much I loved the weight room still at the time, but I was very much an endurance athlete. And one of my first gigs I got after I quit becoming quit being an athlete. And now I was becoming very passionate about becoming a strength and conditioning coach, because I always loved the weight room right from day one. Like when I was, in my early teens, I was a weight room fiend, even though I was also always trying to be a better endurance athlete. But as I exited my phase as my athletic days, I started coaching a group of speed skaters. And at the time, I was programming all aspects of their training. So not just for the sprinters, but also the endurance skaters. And one of the mentors I had at the time was a Dutch speed skating coach named Ingrid Paul. And Ingrid was, she was an Olympian herself. She's a medical doctor. She was very knowledgeable. And Ingrid really helped teach me about how to think about training, basically energy systems. And so she was the one who introduced me to the 5 typical zones, right? Where, you've got zone 1 and 2. So zone 1 being subaerobic, zone 2 being sort of aerobic threshold, zone 3 anaerobic threshold, zone 4 we often call like critical power, zone 5 is aerobic power. And then the 6 and 7 pertain to, especially with speed skaters, we'd use the phraseology lactate capacity and lactate power. And so lactate capacity and lactate power were, especially with middle distance speed skaters, where they need to be good between, say 40 seconds and 2 minutes. They were parts of their training that were really, really crucial for on ice preparation. And so when I built that table out, I was very, very much inspired by my years working as a coach of those distances. And then I was also very much inspired by a paper that is referenced, Stephen Seiler, who's well known in the world of endurance sport. He has an awesome paper that describes kind of a history of interval training. And in that table, in that paper, he's got a couple of tables that I really like. And what was very interesting is, as I was sort of building out methodologies for my own stuff, I had that initial anchor point from my training from that speed skating coach, but I found a lot of parallel with Stephen Seiler's approach. And so I've got that referenced on the table because I think it's part of what's informed my thinking on the topic. But it's just one model that I use to be able to basically build out my interval and my aerobic based training. And I think it's it works for me is how I would put it. And but there's lots of different ways to do it, but it works for me, and it helps me structure training in an effective way for athletes who require either endurance capacity or anaerobic capacities for their sport.
Nice. So because basically I train a lot of like team sport athletes, so how can I like put my athlete into like, or divide it into like these zones, or how should I be training them for like the energy, let's say like for basketball players?
Wow. I mean, it's obviously a big question, and I don't necessarily have. I don't want to just tell you that it depends, because that's the most annoying answer on the planet. I guess here's how I think about it. Number one, I'm glad to see that the pendulum in our world is beginning to shift back to the importance of aerobic capacity. We went through this phase, and I go back to my days being a speed skating coach and working with Olympic athletes in cross country skiing and other endurance athletes. And I can remember, the aerobic work that we would be doing, the zone one, zone two work. And we'd always get these, athletes obviously doing strength and power work and hypertrophy training. And, every single year, you would see athletes go through these periods of basically combined training methods where their hypertrophy would increase, their strength would go up. Admittedly, we had a hard time improving power and rate of force development capacity when we were doing concurrent training. But it was always interesting that I would then go turn to the web, and you would have strength and conditioning coaches basically telling you that the worst thing you could do is combine aerobic training and strength training. Like it's going to increase your cortisol and decrease your testosterone, and you're going to torch everything that ever mattered to you if you combine these things. And we went through an era, I think, where our world very, very much got informed by this idea of high intensity interval training as being the main magic to improve health and performance. And I was like, oh God, well, so much for my methods, because that's not how I see the world. And I just sort of stuck along the course. And I see now that there's very, very much a shift back towards an awareness of how important aerobic capacity work is. So I would start by saying that, not that I would have basketball players going and riding a bike for 4 hours, but I certainly would have in the back of my head understanding that aerobic capacity work is a pretty crucial part of it. And so that's the low end stuff, right? That's not where you're redlining and pushing your gas tank to its max. That's like low end work is extremely valuable in my experience, and essential to support overall long-term sport performance. So that to me is first part of your answer is I really do prioritize zone one and zone two work. Now that's not to mean that basketball players are going to go out for 2-hour runs or something like that, but in a day we're going to try to accumulate a lot of work at low end. The second thing is, and I'll quote Dan Paff on this, is he'll say a work capacity of what? So if you want to build work capacity, your work capacity has to have some level of specificity. That means that if I took a basketball player and I built a work capacity of cycling, that may not transfer over to getting on the court and playing, tons of basketball, where my Achilles tendon, my patellar tendon, and my body needs a completely different level of tolerance to be able to handle load. So, work capacity and aerobic work capacity is not like, you can't just get into thinking, it's another Dan Pathism, he always says it's like you got to think about it like a solar system, right? Like you don't just build the heart and the lungs and the capillarization of your muscles. It's actually a full system that's interacting with this type of training. And there's lots of other considerations when we talk about building capacity. And I think that ties into energy systems, because you could have a big engine, but if your tissues don't have the structural tolerance to handle the load in a specific way, all bets are off. So some ways that I've done this in working with, let's say, skiers, is we would have sessions that would be call them field sessions, but we would string together a 2 to 3 hour session that would involve field-based work, a little bit of change of direction work, band work, resisted walking, med ball work. And if you actually put a heart rate monitor on them over the course of the 2.5 hour session, you would see that their average heart rate was probably 120, 125 beats per minute, might spike up to 140 beats per minute, might come down to 110 beats per minute. But overall, over the course of this whole session, it was a multi-directional, multi-loading session. There was not just one form of loading, but we got the cardiovascular, let's just say the energy system training at that low end in a very well-rounded way. So we were achieving the box of work capacity, right? But we were also doing it in a way that we could tailor it for the sport and the physical demands that they had. So that's a thing I often think about, and it's a way that with, let's say, basketball players or athletes that are involved in other sports that are more technical and tactical in their nature, is to definitely find ways that we can create the energy systems effect for the zone one, zone two work, but also get good training on their bodies in other ways. And then the final thing I'll say on this matter is that my approach to high intensity interval training, when I compare it to what athletes do versus what what you often see in a YouTube fitness influencer post is it is a high quality session. And so, we're not trying to string together, tens of 10, 20, 30 intervals of like just repeat gas. Like it's this idea that you can make anything hard, right? But the goal of that higher end training isn't just to make it hard. I mean, I'll see this sometimes in more of a collegiate setting where you'll look at the training programs that coaches make their athletes do, and it is exactly what we would call in the garbage zone. It's too hard to confer a benefit on the aerobic side, and it's not hard enough to really confer a benefit on the aerobic power and the, let's just say the lactate capacity, lactate power side. It's just in that zone where it is except really, really, really hard and does nothing but to make you gassed. And so I'm very careful in my thinking about how I apply this. I tend to gravitate more towards the polarized approach. I want it to be easy enough that if we're working on the easy aerobic capacity stuff, I'm actually monitoring your heart rate and monitoring your response to keep you on the low end. I don't want you pushing up into the garbage zone. And then on the other hand, when we go to push hard, we look for quality. And we look to make sure that you are ready for that session so that you can give me 100% on it. And it's a good touch on it. We're monitoring your performance in that session. And when performance starts to decline, session's over. So it becomes a very purposeful, polarized approach to training. And, I would just say again, the number of times that I've seen training get done and just really, it is hard, but it's not overly effective. I think that's kind of the third thing about energy system work is you want to make sure that you're doing isn't just difficult. It's not just making you sweat because you can sweat doing anything. It's really about making sure that you're respecting the physiology and respecting the goals of the session and, getting the most out of your athletes when it counts with a good planned approach.
Nice. I love that. All the times I'm looking down at my phone and looking at the notes I took from your course. I love that.
Yeah,
So
good. Well, I mean, yeah.
for those who are interested in what we're talking about, no matter it's like force plate testing or like ACL injury or like the energy system you just mentioned, where can they find the online course or the free content on your website?
Yeah. So if you go to my website, it's www.jordanstrength.com. I have a section called free resources and content, which include video lectures. They include, like, for example, the energy systems table that we're talking about. Like, if you want to go and download the table and see what we're talking about, you can do that. I've also got a similar table for strength and power training called the loading parameter table, but it's a comprehensive table that a lot of people like as a reference to be able to, basically use it as a guide for interaction between, repetition sets, intensity, load, tempo, all that stuff. So my free content section is there. I try to update it every couple of months. I also do a newsletter that you can sign up for that is mostly try to make it informational. And then I've got 4 courses which are a part of basically it's my level 2. I haven't put my level 1 online yet, and my level 3 mentorship is in the works. But basically level 2 is 4 courses, but it gives a deep dive into assessments, the use of dual force plate systems, the science of muscle strength and power. We lay a foundation for the application of all this, and then we go to a deep dive on program design. And in that course is a lot of material that is really good. Like basically a lot of people from, professional sports teams or people who are wanting to get more scientific with their training, they often enjoy those courses because it kind of links together the science and the practice. So you can check them out there. My Twitter, Instagram as well are, my handle is at Jordan Strength. My Instagram, we try to put out content regularly that is educational in its basis. And I would just say that for anybody out there who's interested, stay tuned because I'm going to be launching a level 1 course. We've got a live in-person course that we're going to start doing again now that we're out of COVID. We're hosting one in Phoenix, Arizona in mid-June, which actually we've only got literally a couple spots left, but you can sign up and basically it's a 2-day event. You get the online course part to prep for the 2-day in-person event, and it'll be just sort of a deep practical dive into force plates and assessing athletes. And then we're looking to launch the mentorship part, which will be more of an advanced course that will happen hopefully in the next 10 to 12 months.
Great. Love that.